Welcome into another episode of FCS Rundown with Criswell and the coach. There's only 4 teams left in the mix, but we're here to break down all the bets and the storylines as we head into the FCS semifinals. And, real quick, Gene, though, we're going to take a look back. I'm Josh Criswell, joined as always by my co-host, the coach, Gene Clemons. What was your biggest takeaway from the past week's slate of games? We had a little bit of an interesting setup. Everything got bumped to Sunday. But really, outside of one game, we had some pretty close matchups.
Yeah, I think we had some really good matchups this past weekend, and I feel bad for Jacksonville State, who suffered, the loss of their starting quarterback in the fall, and their backup quarterback Zion Webb comes in and plays really well for them, and then they lose him partway through the first quarter. And now you're playing with a guy who probably never even thought he'd see the field ever. And he played like that. And unfortunately, quarterback play matters at this level. And when you don't get it, you usually lose the game. And so congratulations to Delaware, but they kind of got a little lucky, and you can see it because once they caught on to what Delaware was doing defensively, Delaware did nothing for the rest of that game. But Jacksonville State couldn't put any offense together early, and that's really what just doomed them. If they probably had another 8 minutes, they probably would have ran Delaware down because they finally started to get it together late. But was that a product of Delaware just holding on, or was that a product of them really figuring out some things and getting more comfortable? And then also I think that it's if JMU can get a passing game like they had last week, they're going to be difficult to beat for anybody. I think that's more fool's gold, but I saw it. So if they can get that type of passing game, it's going to be really difficult for any team to beat them.
No doubt. And you brought up kind of an interesting point. Something we've talked about on the show plenty before is how, North Dakota State, they went down to Houston over the weekend and got beat. But, we've talked about it. If you're going to beat North Dakota State, this is the time to do it. And it's kind of on the flip side for Jacksonville State, right? Because it's like, man, wait until you see Jacksonville State in the fall, and then we're going to see what happens, because they have been bitten by the injury bug like crazy. If we could see a full strength Jacksonville State team, I think they're up there and playing with these Final Four teams. But, for me, I think the biggest takeaway was something you mentioned, and it's that, really for the second week in a row, out of all the top dogs in the tournament, it really seems like, I know JMU ended up only winning by single digits against VMI, but, beat UND by double digits. I think they've really been the most dominant team for the first 2 rounds of the postseason.
Yeah, I don't know if they've been the most dominant. I was not impressed with their performance versus VMI. But to me, this has just been the same old JMU all year. They show you flashes of what they can be, which is what they did versus UND, but then they show you that they play down to the level of competition, which I believe they did versus VMI. So they don't get that luxury this week. They're going to have to go in, they're going to have to play, they're going to have to play a full game, and it'll be very interesting to see what happens. To me, I think last week, every team exposed themselves that they have a weakness that can be exploited. It's just a matter of, will the other team be able to exploit that weakness?
Yeah, no doubt. And I mean, James Madison going up against Sam Houston in the FCS semifinals, to me, that game's going to come down to quarterback play, but we're going to get back into that a little bit more. Before we do that, I mean, talk about another huge opportunity for the FCS to be in front of some national eyeballs, that Sam Houston-James Madison game. After the Bearcats were on ESPN, JMU on ESPN2 last week, we're getting a primetime ABC matchup.
Well, I think this is what you hope for when you have an oblong spring season. Like, and you said they got bumped to Sunday. I think ESPN looked up and said, what do we have going on Sunday? Let's put them on Sunday. Now they're looking back and they're like, well, what do we have going on ABC next week? Let's throw them on ABC and see how they rate. So the springtime really gives these teams an opportunity to fall into some areas where there may be some blank holes that football can fill in. That's why all of these leagues keep trying to find a way to have a spring league for a professional league. They just keep coming up short. So I think they have to take advantage of the opportunity. But I feel this way about the FCS the same way I feel about women's basketball. I love women's basketball. I watch women's basketball all the time. But I'm not the one complaining that women's basketball is not getting national attention because I watch it. If the people who are complaining about the FCS getting national exposure and being in this limelight, you have to show up. You have to tune in. You have to be there and be counted. Because if we come back and we're looking at the ratings and the ratings are low again next week on a free channel, now people start having reason to say, well, we don't know. If you can't rate in the springtime on a free channel, then how are you going to be able to rate in the fall up against the juggernaut that is college football at the FBS level and the NFL? So I think that it's going to be a really interesting, really pivotal weekend for the FCS. And I think fans will rise to the occasion.
Yeah, and you brought up a really good analogy with the women's basketball, and, my co-host Matt Fay on the Bet the FCS podcast kind of made a similar point. And I think it's a little bit of a situation too. The ratings by no stretch of the imagination were good, very below average. I think, even then though, still, over 300,000 people tuning into an FCS game is about 300,000 more than we'd normally get, this time of year. So you can't complain about that. But, it is kind of like women's basketball in the sense of if you don't put it in front of our eyeballs, that audience isn't going to grow, right? Like the diehards are there, but like, we know, me and you know as well as anyone, that FCS football is very much a niche area. Like you could very well have about 300,000 FCS diehards. It's about bringing in those casual viewers, as we see in all sports. So it is kind of similar to women's basketball in a way in that sense too, where it's like, yes, the ratings aren't good. And we see that a lot of times, right? When people want to say, oh, we don't put women's basketball on TV because of the ratings. It's like, but did you give them a chance, So it's a little bit of a double-edged sword. I think one thing that I want to kind of point out, though, is the numbers were really bad as far as the ratings specifically. But man, like all over social media, like you look at Twitter accounts all across the board, national outlets, you look at every time. I mean, I had the TV on ESPN all evening long. I counted about 6 or 7 times those next 2 days where I saw Sam Houston, North Dakota State highlights. So yeah, like the ratings weren't great, but there's also a good chunk of people. I mean, this is 2021, a lot of people are seeing this stuff on social media. That's where I saw almost more exposure than anything. And that's kind of what gave me a little bit of hope. And maybe it's the reason why you saw them move this game to ABC, is that you saw interest. Like it wasn't necessarily there reflected in the numbers of the ratings, but everywhere I looked on social media, I know I got a lot of FCS people that I follow, but everywhere I looked, it seemed like it was FCS football all day on Saturday once the Kentucky Derby was done. Or
Absolutely.
Sorry, on Sunday.
Absolutely. And I think what we have to remember, though, is that we probably and we are followed by more people who are interested in the FCS because we cover FCS stuff. And social media has a weird way of making you think that something is more important than what it really is because you're encapsulated by the people that you follow and the people who follow you. But I think that's okay. The thing is it has to grow. It can't just stay stagnant in that one area. Okay, where do we bring in the casuals? And everybody talks about the casuals as if they're some awful thing. And I keep saying, the more you keep referring to them as casuals, the more you keep ostracizing them.
Someone has to pay the checks.
Absolutely. The less they feel included. And if they're going to be the ones who really put you over the top as getting more exposure, then you have to welcome them in. And so hopefully this weekend you see a lot more FCS parties. Like I hope the entire state of Texas adopts Sam Houston and says, you know what, this is our team right now. They don't have any other competition. Why not root for them? It's not like Sam Houston goes up against Texas or Texas A&M or Texas Tech. All of those fans could rally behind Sam Houston right now and get the entire state behind it. If you get the entire state of Texas behind one program, just the buying power alone is phenomenal. So it'll be interesting to see how this rates in Texas. I'd love to get my hands on those numbers. I'd love to see how it rates on the East Coast because JMU is involved. And, you know, there's this tendency to believe there's an East Coast bias, except for in the FCS, it's really more of a Missouri Valley bias. So will they be paying attention? I'd love to know what the ratings do up in those areas to see if people are paying attention now that you don't have a North Dakota State in there. So we'll see. It'll be interesting to check out.
Yeah, you know, just real quick before we move on to the gambling stuff, I know that's what a lot of our listeners are tuned in for, but, you know, something that I think would help the FCS grow in popularity is embracing gambling. I mean, you talk about one of the fastest growing areas in sports, and it's right there, just prime for the taking, but it's never going to happen. I mean, I was sitting there settling in, getting ready to cover the Sam Houston-Monmouth game, and what do you have playing on the big screen right before kickoff? An NCAA sanctioned message about why gambling is bad.
All the while still releasing all of their information to these gambling sites so that they can put their stuff up there.
It's funny how that works, right?
It's funny. Like, you can't say that you're against something while also enabling them to be able to do what they're doing. Embracing it would just be, it's a smart thing to do. And everybody worries about the integrity of the game, but let's be real about it. There are so many other factors that bring the integrity of the game into question that we're really going to start thinking about gambling as one of those things. Like, come on, stop it. It's not like gambling just started. It's been here forever.
And whether or not they decide to take a stance against it, guess what? People are still going to be throwing their money down.
Absolutely.
Well, David Graf, we got our producer with us on the show. Usually we throw it to him for rapid fire picks. Going to do that in a second. But we have some DraftKings national title futures odds. I love that they did this, by the way. They released them at the start of the playoffs. Didn't have any the past couple weeks, but now we got the Final Four set. We can do a little bit of futures odds to see who's going to be taking home the hardware in Frisco. David Graf, what do we got?
All right, we kick off the national title odds. Let's start with the biggest long shot left, Delaware. They're plus 800 to take home a natty.
Normally, I'm all about, you know, longer odds, especially when you get this close to the end, because I feel like anybody has an opportunity to win it. But I just see too many cracks in the armor, too many things that I don't like about this Delaware, especially on offense, that makes me believe they just don't have enough in the tank. So I don't know if I would waste my money because I don't know if they legitimately have a chance to win it. So I probably would fade that if that's me.
I'm kind of torn on it because I'm the same way. I love those big payouts. If I'm doing anything futures bets, it's usually 5-1 or more odds. So that kind of eliminates everybody but Delaware for me. And I guess I'll throw, you know, maybe 10 on it just to have a little fun. While they haven't been the most impressive, probably been the least impressive of the three teams still standing. As you mentioned earlier in the show, everybody that's still playing right now, they have shown weaknesses where you can be exposed and you can get beat. And I think I just like the odds of a team that, while they've had their ups and downs in the playoffs, they were pretty dominant during the regular season, you know, really didn't give up, you know, didn't have the best competition in the world, but played some decent teams. And the thing that I liked about them is they've been able to win with defense all year long. The only 2 times they gave up more than 14 points, it came during garbage time. So I like Delaware just as that long shot. I think at 8-1, I like their odds just about as good as anybody.
We move next. We head way south, Sam Houston State. They're plus 300.
So I think that when you look back on this, Sam Houston will have had probably one of the toughest runs through an FCS playoff that I can remember if they're able to pull this off. I mean, that Monmouth team doesn't get enough love. Like, that's a good team.
They're a legit top 10 team in the country.
Legitimate. And, you know, for everything that I've mentioned about North Dakota State this spring, they're still North Dakota State, and they still will find a way to beat you if you let them. So getting that win, and now they have to go against JMU, so they have a chance to sweep the entire championship battery of last year. And then if they get by JMU, they're going to have to go against, most likely, in my opinion, South Dakota State or Delaware, probably a South Dakota State, which means that they're going to go through a bunch of really, really good teams in order to get to the championship. And while I think that plus 300 isn't exactly a number that I love, if I'm putting money down on any futures, it's probably putting money down on Sam Houston to get it done.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. And I know we'll talk about James Madison here in just a little bit, but I'm almost thinking about hedging my money with a little bit on both of those teams, just because I think there's such a good chance of the winner of that game emerging and going on and taking home that title. But I'm right there with you. I love Sam Houston. I like the idea of being able to put down 40 and having it pay out, 120? I think that's a pretty smart investment. I mean, if you're talking about a team that's, while they haven't always looked as dominant as they did earlier in the seasons, they have gone out there and beat 2 of the top 10 teams in the country the past 2 weeks. And so, I mean, it's going to be their toughest test of the season, without a doubt, this Saturday. But I like the idea of throwing, maybe 20 to 40 down and having a nice little payoff on that one.
We move next to James Madison, one of the preseason title favorites. They're plus 275 here with 4 teams left.
It's interesting because I think if we had flipped the teams, I'd feel a lot better about James Madison at this number. If James Madison was playing South Dakota State, I think I would feel better about them. But because they have to go Sam Houston to potentially a South Dakota State, that's tough, especially at the number. Again, I look at it, I didn't love the Sam Houston number. I obviously love the JMU number much less. I think it'd be an interesting play if I was able to put together like a semifinal, final 2-pick parlay to take them to win this week and win the championship game. I am inclined to believe whoever wins this Sam Houston James Madison's game will ultimately be the champion. But if I'm fading one, I'd probably put money on this, but I would definitely look to try to get something on the other end to kind of make sure I get it paid off.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. I think if I have anything on this game, it's hedging my bets a little bit between Sam Houston and JMU. I still like the payout, but it's just, for me, once you get under 3-1, I'm not really touching any futures odds for me, unless I feel really strongly and, wanted to maybe, if I didn't really love the board this week and wanted to put down something, maybe I'd hedge that right there with Sam Houston, James Madison for one of those two to win it all. But I'm not in love with this one. Probably the one I'm least in love with, aside from the one that David Graf's about to mention.
The final odds are for South Dakota State, who you're going to have to lay down some cash to get some back. They're minus 167.
Yeah, and the only way I ever put any money on a minus is if I'm feeling 100% confident they're going to win. And I just can't feel that way, not because I don't think South Dakota State's playing well. I think they're playing well, but, they have to play either Sam Houston or JMU, and that's the 2 best defenses in the country. So, and both of them, by the way, are really adept at stopping the run, which is what South Dakota State does best. So if I had to put money on them, it would only be because I felt like they had an opportunity to just run away with this thing. That's the only time you should really give money away to a minus anything. And so definitely as a futures bet, I'm not a fan of it. I'm gonna fade that one.
Not at all. I'm fading that one bit. And I mean, if I could do it, I would almost bet the field against South Dakota State with the odds they're giving you there. And I've liked South Dakota State all season long. I think they're going to be playing in the championship game next week. I just, for the same exact reason you mentioned, I know that Mark Gronowski has done a great job this year at quarterback for them, but you have to remember that, in my opinion, the thing that makes him most dangerous is his running ability, and most specifically his downhill running ability. And I just don't see how well that's going to work against, the defensive fronts you'll see with a James Madison or Sam Houston. So I think that, combined with, as we all saw, Sam Houston had no problem shutting down one of the best running games in the country last week against North Dakota State. So I like South Dakota State a lot. I'm definitely going to be keeping an eye on them as far as the spreads are concerned, but I'm definitely staying away from them and as far away as possible for anything futures related.
We move from future bets to this weekend's bets. You don't have to think about them very long. Let's start with that South Dakota State team. They're taking on Delaware. They're an 8-point favorite.
I think that for me, as much as I've appreciated what Delaware has done this year, I think my co-host has been a lot more bullish on them than I have. I don't see a way they stop this South Dakota State attack. I think that they've been fortunate to draw the way that they've drawn. And because of that, they've been able to move to this level. But now they run up against an entirely new beast. 11-on-11 football they're playing in South Dakota, not 10-on-11. And I think that makes the difference. I see South Dakota State getting it done. I see them getting it done by at least 2 touchdowns.
Yeah, I see South Dakota State as the winner in this one. I just have a hard time picking more than a touchdown. That's what I'm going to have to keep an eye on, because if that falls maybe somewhere around that 5.56 range, I might have to flip onto the Jackrabbits. But, for me, I'm rolling with Delaware in the plus 8 points purely just because of how that defense is played. I think South Dakota State's going to win it. I think they'll kind of start rolling in the second half. But as we've seen, they're more than prone to slow starts. So I think that Delaware's defense is going to keep them in that range. South Dakota State pulls it out late, but I don't see it being by more than 7 points.
Odds makers think that the second game of the weekend is going to be a tough one, a battle, if you would. James Madison is a 1.5-point favorite against Sam Houston.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we've seen now that Sam Houston is just not going to be a favorite this entire time. Really interesting for a team that hasn't lost all year, who's been a top 5 team most of the year, who's now going up against teams who've all had question marks, and yet not one time in this playoff have they been the favorite, even though they're the higher seed at home. Rarely do you see it, but I also want to let bettors know, anytime you see a line like this and the home team isn't a 3-point or more dog, that really means that Vegas is just trying to set a line that'll be played on both sides. If they put that line at plus 3 for Sam Houston, everybody would slam Sam Houston. If they put it at minus 3 or minus whatever for Sam Houston, then everybody would jump on JMU. So they're trying to get the money to go right down the middle, and so they're teetering with this line. To me, you just go into this, you don't look at a line, you just say, who is the better team? And for me, the better offense resides in Sam Houston. The better overall defense probably resides in James Madison. The problem is the second best defense probably resides in Sam Houston, and it's right next to the first best defense. But JMU's offense is nowhere near the second best offense. So when I do that math, that quick dirty math, I go, Sam Houston has more offensive weapons. They get it done with the pass and with the run. They play just as good a defense, and they're used to shutting down the run. They shut down Monmouth. I believe they're 18th in the country in rushing. They shut down North Dakota State. They're top 5 in rushing. They shut down one of the best runners in the country. I mean, they've been tested time and time again, and every time they get tested, they come up spades. So as long as they get the special team stuff that we saw last week, which was really, really weird, they haven't done it all year. As long as they get that taken care of, I feel very confident in saying Sam Houston is going to win this game.
Yeah, I'm right there with you on Sam Houston. I think it's one of those situations where you mentioned it. Those defenses are so neck and neck that there's not really much separation. And if you look really at the offenses, there's not much separation. I think until you get to the quarterback position. I think that's kind of where you see the difference. I know JMU's had its issues at the quarterback position. Cole Johnson come on strong as of late. Really impressive performance. Got to give it to him against what I thought was a pretty solid North Dakota defense. So definitely something to watch out for. I just think that Eric Schmid is so much of a dynamic playmaker that he's kind of the X factor. If you look at a game that's so evenly matched, you look at who's going to have the ball in their hands whenever their team's driving down the field to try to win the game in the final minutes. And, what did Eric show us last week? He showed us that he's the kind of quarterback that can go out and get the job done whenever the game's on the line. So, for me, I've got to go with Eric Schmid and the Bearcats right there. Winning that one plus the 1.5 points easy. But if you're throwing down money on this and you like the Bearcats, you might as well just go with that money line and get your even money back.
Absolutely. And something that's very interesting about Schmidt is because he's extremely athletic, yet when he runs, it's not someone that's running as like a game breaker. It's someone that's running to keep the chains moving. He does a great job of getting those yards that just keep the drive alive. And that's what's dangerous, because it's easy to stop a quarterback from breaking long runs. It's extremely hard to stop an athletic quarterback from picking up a few yards. And he is fantastic at picking up a few yards. And all of a sudden you look at the end of the game and he's been responsible for about 4 to 5 first downs that you thought you were going to get off the field, but he was able to make something happen and keep the drive alive. And a lot of times that's the difference between a win and a loss. It was definitely the difference between a win and a loss last week versus North Dakota State.
100%. Also pivotal in that, the Bearcats struggled with turnovers all regular season long, didn't go a single game in the regular season without a turnover. They haven't turned the ball over yet this postseason, and they've gone up against 2 stout defenses. And that's probably what's impressed me as much as anything about Eric Schmid and that Bearcat offense is that, they've always talked all season long about how they need to clean things up, and it never seemed like they did. Then all of a sudden we get to the playoffs and they're playing as clean a football as I've seen all season long.
Absolutely. I think this will be an interesting game because we know that James Madison is going to try to impose their will on the ground. The problem is Sam Houston's seen this show before. They've seen this game before. Now, can Johnson be as good or at least comparable to what he was last week versus North Dakota? If he can, then JMU has a chance to win. If he's the quarterback that I've seen almost all year, they're not winning that game.
I'm right there with you. Now, as we always do, we close out the show with a little bit of a parlay for the listeners, but since we only got 2 games to bet on, going to shake it up this time. I know some of the different betting apps out there will let you get a little same game parlay action. So that's how me and the coach are going to close it out today. Gene, looking at these lines, you've got the Delaware South Dakota State game, an 8-point spread, 37.5 point over under. You look at Sam Houston JMU, 1.5 points, essentially a pick 'em, and then a 47.5 point over under. Which one of those games, are you rolling with if you got to do a same game parlay?
I think it's clear you have to go with the 2 best defenses in the FCS and take the under. I could easily see this being a 21-14 game or a 17-10 game. This is one of those games where you're probably not going to see a lot of touchdowns because these 2 teams don't give up a lot of touchdowns, especially when you're talking about Sam Houston and their ability to hold tight in the red zone. They have the best red zone defense remaining in the playoffs. JMU's right there. Both of those teams are going to be able to stop third downs. They both have some of the best third down defenses in the country, not just in the playoffs, but in the entire FCS. So I think points are going to be at a premium. So if you're asking me which one I'm doing, I'm probably going to go with the under in that game and take Sam Houston to win.
I like that. Something that I'm thinking though, I'm gonna switch it up a little bit and go against you. I'm gonna go Sam Houston money line just because at 1.5, you might as well just take the money line to get a little bit extra juice on your payout. And then I'm gonna take the over, and the only reason why, I think this game's going to overtime. That's what worries me.
It changes the whole dynamic if it goes into overtime.
And these two teams too, as good as those defenses are, they have multiple guys. And like we saw just a couple weeks ago, JMU backed up to their 1 yard line. VMI thinks they have a chance, and boom, 99 yards to the house. I think longest run in FCS history. And then as we've seen with Jaquez Ezzard, Ife Adeyi, Eric Schmid, those guys in the Bearcat offense, they also have guys that even against stout defenses can sneak one over the top and easily break off a touchdown in any play.
Here's what'll be interesting for people to watch. North Dakota had a lot of success throwing the back shoulder fade versus JMU. And they did that probably because their receivers, while dynamic in their own way, they're not burners. They're not blowing people off the top. So they used their big body receivers. They had the quarterback put the ball on the back shoulder. They made a lot of catches like that. Well, now in steps these athletes from Sam Houston who can beat you over the top. If they see JMU giving a lot of cushion because they want to bend but don't break, watch for those guys that have 8, 9, 10, 11 receptions in the game and really be able to just kill them with 14, 15-yard back shoulder fade balls all day. It'll be something to watch. I know that their coaching staff had to see it. They've got one of the best coaching staffs in the country. They had to notice it. It was the first thing that I noticed. It was a legitimate game plan by South Dakota. By North Dakota. There's too many Dakotas going on right now. It was literally a game plan by North Dakota. I noticed it probably the third or fourth ball they threw. A lot of it was on the back shoulder on purpose. We know that Schmidt has excellent accuracy. We know he can drop the ball in a bucket. We saw him do it last week. That could be something that can definitely change the dynamic, because if they get hit with one or two of those back shoulders, all of a sudden those corners start getting a little bit cheeky. They just hit them over the top because they have the athletes to blow right by these guys.
No doubt. And I mean, something too we've seen from Sam Houston really all season long is they love to utilize the wheel routes with their running backs. They got a couple guys, Ramon Jefferson, Noah Smith can hurt you as a runner or a receiver. And they've done that a lot, whether it's sneaking guys out in the flats while Jaquez Ezzard and Ife Adeyi are taking the safeties deep, or sending them on a crossing route. They got a ton of those. Like the play that they broke for a 40, 50-yard touchdown pass, they had a couple guys going on deep routes, and Noah Smith just comes across the middle. They get him the ball, and no one's within 20 yards of him.
And I don't want people to think that we're down on JMU. Just understand when I talk about these things, I talk from a coaching standpoint. JMU, they have not seen Sam Houston. They've not seen a team like Sam Houston in the way in which Sam Houston does business. Sam Houston has seen a JMU before. They've seen a predominant run defense that has issues in the passing game, but has some dynamic receivers that if you get them the ball, they can be spectacular. I think the Monmouth game is a perfect game for them to use as a parallel to what JMU does. Obviously, Monmouth not as good on defense, but offensively, very similar. Quarterback is probably better than what JMU has, but running game, very similar. And so, especially with the way that they pound the big backs and then come in with the other guys as compliments. I like JMU a lot. I think JMU is a quarterback away. Sorry, Johnson. Probably a great guy. I'll buy you a drink one day when you're old enough to drink, if you're not old enough yet. I think they're a quarterback away. I think that's going to hurt them. You've already talked about it before.
No doubt. Just real quick before we close it out, since we didn't give anyone any action on that Delaware South Dakota State game as far as the same game, one that I'm going to throw out there, if you want to get really risky, I know you're not going to like it because it includes a Delaware money line play this week, but just if you want something to pay out big time, if Delaware wins the game, it's because that under 37.5 points hits. I think a low-scoring game plays towards Delaware's hand. And so if you're looking for something, maybe you want to have a little bit interest on that one, throw 10, 20 bucks on a Delaware money line plus that 37.5 point under.
I'll give you one on that game, and I'll go opposite. I won't go opposite of the over/under because here's what my question is. How does Delaware score?
It's a very good question, as we've seen the past couple weeks.
So if it's going to be hard for Delaware to score, and we know how South Dakota State's going to try to score, one score might do it. So especially if you're on the South Dakota State side like I am, I could easily see this game being 17-3. And if that's the case, I'm going to take South Dakota State, and I'm going to take that under, and we'll take our chances.
We'll see what happens. You've been listening to FCS Rundown with Criswell and the coach. I'm Josh Criswell. He's Gene Clemons. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, Spotify, wherever you listen to your podcasts. We've got you covered. We'll talk to you next time.
5 stars.